Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today's town hall hosted by the Muslim Legal Fund of America on Gaza political speech and activities. It is my honor to introduce our two guests today. As you may know, Muslim Legal Fund is a nonprofit full-service defense fund dedicated to defending Muslim civil rights and liberties at a federal level. And today, our guests are Charles Swift and Sufia Khalid. Charles Swift is a criminal defense department head at Muslim Legal Fund. He's nationally recognized expert in the field of national security law and was named by the National Law Review as one of the top 100 legal advocates for his work in civil rights. He's been with the Muslim Legal Fund for 15 years. And our second guest, Sufia Khalid, is the staff attorney in MLFA's Federal Criminal Defense Department, where she represents individuals unjustly charged with national security-related crimes during counterterrorism investigations at trial and appeal and in post-conviction matters in federal courts across the country. So please join me in welcoming Charlie and Sufia.
Good afternoon. My name's Charlie Swift, and I'm going to start off on this. And then Sufia, our associate attorney in the Criminal Defense Department, and my partner at trial, is going to finish it up with the implications inside Gaza. So I'm going to talk to you for the first 15 minutes about the trends in national security prosecutions and their so that you know what their implications are for speech. Next slide, please. First thing to talk about before I get into this is what I'm not going to talk about. Inside speech-related cases, there are two categories. One of those categories is called place and manner. That's not what you're saying, but where you're saying it and the activities associated with it. Place and manner restrictions are the types of things that you're seeing on college campus. They say that speech violates a place or manner, or that or activities have become violent, or they can't sustain it, it's unhealthy, something like that. They take great pains to say we're not censoring the speech itself. I'm going to talk to you about content in speech, what can be censored and what can't be. And I began this with the idea, and I want to explain and make very clear. The founding fathers, the authors of the Constitution of the United States, believed that it was extraordinarily important for people to be able to petition the government and to tell the government when it was wrong and have their voices be heard. That was an essential idea because that's the only way a democracy ever gets better. Every big change in the United States has occurred because of people speaking out against U.S. policy. That's the way things are changed in this country, and it's essential. So the Constitution affords broad protections. And in fact, the Supreme Court has absolutely recognized that speech can get heated, that political and religious speech has to be protected, though, unless it presents a clear exception, like speech that is a true threat or a threat to incite violence. Those are the two ideas. The court has said that true threats, for instance, an example of that is a former spouse threatening his wife online or his former wife online with, if you don't give over the kids, I'm going to kill you. They said that's not got value in a political discourse. That's threatening somebody to cause them personal harm. So those true threats of violence against somebody are not protected. The other one is an incitement to violence. In other words, there's a large group of people, they say, hey, go beat that guy up. That's not protected. That's an incitement to immediate violence is not protected. But the Supreme Court has made clear that in Brandenburg versus Ohio, that the rest of it is protected. And another case called Black versus Virginia. But we'll move on from that. However, in our experience, and this is important to understand, that Muslim advocates, even if their speech is protected, doesn't mean it isn't targeted. And it's targeted and has been targeted for the last 20 or so years, or really even earlier than that, even earlier than 9/11. And what we've found over the years is that people who are critical of the United States, particularly Muslims who are political for the United States' political positions, find themselves the target of terrorism investigations. That's been a recurring theme, and that advocates are the first line being targeted. And next slide. How do they target them? If they can say what they want, how are they targeted? Well, they're targeted primarily under a statute that was passed in the 90s, 18 U.S.C. 2339B, which is called material support of a designated terrorist organization. And it says that anyone who provides material support or resources to a foreign terrorist organization or attempts to conspire to do so can be fined or imprisoned. Now, wait a second. What's a designated terrorist organization and what's material support? Well, a designated terrorist organization are those foreign organizations, they have to be foreign, who are designated by the Secretary of State as terrorist organizations. It's fully okay to disagree with who they designate, but the problem is that's not a defense. You can't say, well, the Secretary shouldn't have designated them, they're not terrorists. Nope, the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld the idea in lower courts that the designation cannot be assailed. What's material support then? Next slide. Material support began as an effort to prevent foreign terrorist organizations from obtaining funds. The belief was that terrorist organizations were receiving money in the guise of humanitarian aid, i.e. money for medical supplies, money for food, money for clothing and shelter for orphans, things like that. But that these funds were being siphoned off to pay for terrorism. And they said, well, we can't stop that. And then even if we can't prove that it's being siphoned off, they came up with what's called the fungible theory. In that theory, well, the terrorist organization might use the funds or control the funds for humanitarian purposes, but then they don't have to spend that money, their other monies on those purposes, so they could use them for attacks. So money was the first thing to be outlawed. Next slide. Does that mean material support's just money? Nope. Besides sending money to a terrorist organization, giving contact information, if someone to help them go over and join a terrorist organization, has been held by some, as at least one of our cases, been alleged to be material support. Joining an FTO and then traveling overseas so that you can be part of that organization, or attempting to do so, or agreeing to do that, all of those have been found to be material support of terrorism. And that's under the idea of providing personnel. Speech made in coordination or at the direction of the FTO has also been argued to be terrorism. And in fact, that's the idea of providing services to the terrorist organization. And they've even gone so far as to say sharing a link to somebody to the FTO's website where they raise money, that could be material support of terrorism. So something as benign as, hey, what jihadist group should I give to? Well, these guys seem okay. Sharing that link, the government alleged was material support of terrorism. So what you're seeing is that it's pretty broad. Next slide. What's important to understand in the context of speech, because Holder versus humanitarian law was a First Amendment challenge to 2339B, and that's a speech challenge. And what the Supreme Court held was that the 2339B was constitutional because the statute allowed for independent advocacy and it only prohibited it if it, one, provided a benefit, but two, also occurred at the direction or in coordination with the organization. What they said there was, if you were speaking to the organization or speaking on behalf of the organization at their direction, or speaking in coordination, in other words, working with the organization, providing a service, then one would be personnel, the other would be service, then that speech, even though all it was doing was talking, would be criminal. Next slide. So inside the speech concerns, you need to understand that there are a lot of different definitions. An attempt doesn't actually require you to talk to a terrorist organization at all. An attempt is just trying to do the thing. This comes into play in an awful lot of the undercover operations. The FBI creates fake representatives. The people never actually talk to anybody who's in a terrorist organization. They don't coordinate with them, but they say, well, they were attempting to or conspiring to. People agree to do something. They don't even in the conspiracy have to do anything in furtherance. They just have to agree that, hey, look, we're going to speak out. Somebody says, well, I'm a member, purports to be a member of a terrorist organization, and they say, okay, we're going to agree to help you by doing the following things. That's enough. And then speech is criminalized, as I've already said, when the activity is made in coordination or at direction. If it's completely independent, then it's not. Next slide. Before that, I need to stop before I go into these. I want to talk about something. One of the things on directed and coordinated that's come out in recent cases is with the beginning of ISIS, you saw organizations that had a significant online presence and they would call for things. And the government has argued in some cases that simply answering the call, in other words, never talking to them, never doing anything on that part, but doing something that these organizations have publicly called for, in particular in ISIS's case, attacks on America or attacks in Europe, that if they called for that and they did it after reading those calls for attack, then that was under their direction or at their direction. When it comes to speech, the courts so far have absolutely, to date, said no. A publicly available call for things like protest or speeches against or anything like that, that's independent advocacy unless you can show a direct coordination with someone in Hamas. That these publicly called things would expand and eat the exception for public advocacy completely in many cases. So that's not been a basis so far, but it's important to understand that individuals and private organizations are trying to make that leap. One of the things that we found is that advocates are targeted by the FBI, as I said before. In the United States, there's Asia Siddiqui, who was a client of ours. She'd been a protester for years. And the FBI put informants against her after she'd been one of the public speakers and all of that, and eventually tried to persuade her to participate in learning about making a bombing attack. In the United States versus Syria and Petros, she was a nonviolent advocate. She was enraged by what was happening in Syria. She saw thousands of children and families being killed, and she was enraged with what she saw, and she spoke out against it repeatedly. Over the course of her speaking out, she received she was targeted by more than 3 undercover informants who eventually were able to put her in such a compromised position that she could be charged. Again, even though she had absolutely no desire to participate in violence. But over 4 years, they were able to get enough. So that's something that every advocate has to be aware of, that they can be targeted. Now, next slide. Next slide. So wait a second. Why would anybody, everybody's saying, yeah, it won't be me. And if they do, isn't that entrapment? Yes, it's entrapment. But the problem is the defense rarely, if ever, works in this process. The entrapment defense doesn't work because the FBI says that the court and Justice Department argued that the people were predisposed based on that protected speech that they'd made beforehand. And, it makes it very hard to say, well, they wouldn't do this when they were protesting on behalf of. So when you're protesting, you have to make sure, or advocating a part that, hey, look, I'm not going to put myself in a compromised position so that my voice is compromised. The other reason that I think that it's happened more and more is in the online world. Young people are less inhibited in general on this. They're often baited, they're isolated. There's a reason that there are billions of dollars of scams every year that go off online. When people send money, they become isolated. They want to believe the people they're talking to, and they allow themselves to do things that they would never do if they had time to think about it or were thinking through this clearly, et cetera, on it, that they just would not do that. Online is a great place to organize, to do all those things, but it's also not without risk. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sufia, because Sufia is going to talk to you about where we are now with Gaza.
All right, thanks, Charlie. Next slide, please. So Charlie's gone through, the legal landscape for what's been happening with national security prosecutions in the last 5 to 10 years, the trends that we've seen. We specialize in these cases, so we see a lot of them. And I think it's important, for the community to have a realistic understanding of where criminal law actually stands in that area, what type of speech is criminalized, how it's criminalized, what the cases look like. And that's important because, part of our goal is we want to teach people how to be, Muslim activists or Arab activists, advocates, without letting the fear that is generated by this national security criminal world, without letting that fear silence you, or without letting legal ignorance of the law and where these laws actually are lead to activities that can discredit your movement or, even hurt the cause. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about what are the implications based on everything we now understand about what these prosecutions look like for what's happening now, right? We see a lot of political speech online, protesters, organizing, fundraising, international fundraising, all of these activities that are really important and critical for the movement. But let's talk about, what is, with everything we've just discussed, what are the implications for those activities? Next slide. Where we can start is this statement that was given by the director of the FBI on their new counterterrorism focus. Christopher Wray made this statement about a month or two ago. And what stood out here is that they stated they've changed their whole focus now, and that their most immediate concern has been that individuals or small groups will draw twisted inspiration from the events in the Middle East to carry out attacks here at home. They also said that they expect that October 7th and the conflict that's followed will feed a pipeline of radicalization and mobilization for years to come. What does that tell us about how the FBI's counterterrorism division is looking at this? It says that they expect this to be long-term. They've already been doing thousands of these investigations, and that's consistent with what we're seeing. We've been getting dozens of calls, a week, sometimes from people that have been approached by the FBI to be informants or are being investigated, people that are concerned about things that they're seeing online. So this tells us, that they expect this to be their main focus. Remember, they get $4 billion a year for these counterterrorism investigations. So this is not only just a very broad group of people, but this is the microscope going in and looking and scrutinizing at each one of them individually. Why? Because I have another statement at the bottom there. James Comey, former head of the FBI, had said about their counterterrorism operations that they're looking for a needle in a stack of needles. That tells us how they view, the Muslim, the activist, Arab community. And that is, they don't really know what they're looking for. So this thousands of reported threats that they're talking about, this is that zooming in on a huge variety of people, the mass surveillance that we've talked about and these investigations. Next slide, please. One problem we've seen with these this broad lens is there's a lot of biases that go into play here, right? There's anti-Muslim bias, anti-Arab, anti-Asian racist bias, cognitive bias, sometimes assuming that there's going to be this terrorist element or this terrorist threat, this long-term mobilization that the FBI is talking about. And that, viewed through that lens, can cast these sinister, almost evil aspersions onto innocent online speech, protected political speech, protected religious speech. And that leads to a lot of problems in these cases. Next slide. All right. So a question I've gotten is when we do some of these presentations is, well, no one's been recently prosecuted yet for material support of Hamas or any of the other organizations. So it's not going to happen, right? It's been over 7 months. If it was going to happen, it would have happened by now. That's not consistent with what we've seen. FBI counterterrorism investigations go on from anywhere between a year to 4 years. And especially the sting operations that can involve multiple informants, undercover agents, online covert agents. These investigations take a lot of time. So we expect from everything we've seen in these investigations before is that many of these investigations have likely started, but that we will not see the prosecutions for another few months and probably over the years to come after that. Next slide, please. So what do we think that these prosecutions are going to look like? There are 4 designated foreign terrorist organizations in Palestine. Designated foreign terrorist organizations are designated by the Secretary of State in the United States. That is an executive decision, and it is all of the laws that Charlie talked about. It is illegal to provide any type of support to those organizations, the only exceptions being the medical supplies and religious materials. Hamas is the most commonly known organization, but there's also the PFLP, General Command, General PFLP, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Those are all designated. Other associated groups, in that region are Hezbollah and the Houthis. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for the type of speech we're seeing? This is one major area of concern, is online speech. We're seeing, in a lot of these groups, in private groups, on public social media, things like this image here on the right, the protester holding a sign up that says Al-Qassam's next target with an arrow pointing at Israeli supporters. Would that on its own be criminal? No, probably not, right? But this both raises a designated foreign terrorist organization and is problematic speech that would be interesting to law enforcement. So that while this may not on its own be criminal, then you look at looking into the social media. If they're in a lot of private social media groups where they're speaking positively about Hamas, or they've reposted some of the Hamas statements calling for, support by students and things, then you start establishing more of that link, that direction and control link that Charlie was talking about. So that's concerning. Other things we've seen, like the image on the left, there was a protest, a peaceful student protest, where a bunch of counter protesters, pro-Israeli protesters, had started a "Kill the Jews" chant. Luckily, there was a video of it. So later they realized these were counter protesters, and this wasn't threatening speech. But without that, it could be very problematic. And just the fact that statement had been made there was what was the impetus used to go and arrest over 100 of those protesters. Next slide, please. Other concerns we're seeing with social media is, online, since Charlie had talked about this, people are a lot less inhibited online, especially young people that spend a lot of time online. There seems to be this dissonance, cognitive dissonance between how people speak online and how they speak in the real world. But in terms of how law enforcement and the law views speech, all speech is viewed the same. There isn't a lower threshold for the criminalization of speech if it's online speech. And in fact, in many of our cases, the vast majority of our cases now, all the criminal conduct took place online in social media, amongst friends, in private Telegram groups, or other types of social media groups. One post I have up here was a post that recently went viral in the Palestine community and an activist online community, pro-Palestine community. And it was problematic, but not necessarily illegal on its own, right? It's not illegal on its own. It was hashtag support the resistance. It had this red triangle, and it said we have to start being more vocal about the support of supporting the Palestinian resistance. The West labels our resistance as terrorism to intimidate us from speaking out, but we will no longer be silent. We only fear Allah. Speak out on your support for the resistance and add a triangle to your profile. So what are the concerns here? Palestinian resistance, right? And the acknowledgement there that the West calls it terrorism. That's a very clear reference to Hamas, possibly other organizations the United States has designated as foreign terrorist organizations. But also this red triangle. You know, we all know that red triangle was popularized from the videos that Hamas was releasing where they had their targeted attacks, you know, against their Israeli military targets with the red triangle pointing at the target. So that, you know, while it's not illegal on its own, for thinking about it through the counterterrorism, FBI, law enforcement lens, this is somebody who's saying that they support Palestinian resistance. They know it's called terrorism, so they're probably talking about Hamas, and they've put that red triangle in there. So when there is, if this person, the concern, right? What is the concern? If this person is approached in a private group by an online person asking them, how can we support the resistance? How much should we support the resistance? What else should we do? Which group are you talking about? What are they going to say? What are these investigations going to look like? Next slide, please. All right, and then the other area for potential, you know, prosecutions that we're concerned about is a lot of this aid that's going in. Charlie talked about funding and how that has been criminalized as material support in the past, especially in Palestine. Next slide, please. So the issue with Gaza is that in 2005, Hamas won the election in Gaza, which means that they de facto exercise, you know, control over the region, right? There's that argument that if they're the government there, that they exercise some control over any of the aid and other activities that are taking place there. Next slide. And that direction, you know, goes to what Charlie was talking about earlier, the direction and control. So whereas if you were just sending money to Mexico or, you know, anywhere else, if it's not de facto controlled by a designated terrorist organization, then you know that automatic link isn't necessarily there. So there are concerns about how to donate there and how to do it safely with these concerns in place. Next slide. All right. So is it illegal? Is it just unlawful to donate to any of these, you know, thousands of GoFundMe campaigns and similar campaigns that we see? No, it's not unlawful, right? The concern here, though, is that there are risks because of this, the various designated terrorist organizations in the region and Hamas's control. So we have concerns where we see very vague campaigns that don't say who exactly they're supporting, what the money's going to be used for, and people donating to strangers if they don't know who they are. They're not direct family members, because these are questions GoFundMe, you know, and the FBI will have is, well, there's all these organizations there. There's active fighting. Who was the money going to? Who did they believe the money was going to? There have been several prosecutions in this area saying that, you know, humanitarian aid or giving to charity was used as cover for terrorist financing. So doing that in a safe way, right? Getting legal advice, especially if you want to send large amounts of money, you know, there's a way to do that. But if you want to do that, do it safely. Get legal advice, you know, figure out how to vet and make sure that your transaction is transparent, vetted, and safe. Next slide. All right. So when should you call a criminal defense attorney with expertise in national security law? Generally, the answer is this: as soon as you have any questions. We get the absolute best results the earlier people come to us, before there's ever an investigation, right? Before there's an indictment. That first time you have a question, if you are thinking of donating to something, if you have concerns about your speech you've already made, or speech other people maybe in your groups have made, if any of this is, rang a bell, or you are planning, some action and you have questions, reach out for legal advice early on, because we're available, widely to advise on this. We take a lot of calls. We give advice. We understand people have a lot of concerns, and we want to help quell those concerns by empowering you with good legal advice, so that everybody knows that what they're doing is lawful, and you can be confident in your activities. The other side is, if you're approached by the FBI, don't speak to the FBI without an attorney. Even if you feel you've done nothing wrong, it must be a misunderstanding, or you feel like it might look like you're hiding something, don't speak to the FBI without an attorney. The most commonly charged federal crime in one of these failed investigations is they charge lying to the FBI. So if for no other reason than that, always have an attorney present when you speak to law enforcement. All right, we're going to open it up for questions now.
Sufia and Charlie, thank you so much. That was a lot of amazing insight that not only allows us to understand our rights, but allow us to better navigate through the challenges that we face today. One of the questions from the audience is, if one is protesting in disguise and they become arrested, is law enforcement allowed to remove any coverings that are perhaps for religious expression or privacy? A lot of our students, they might be covering their faces such that future employers don't see it and it doesn't impact them as part of their future careers.
It's a part inside arrests and then identity. When law enforcement is arresting someone, they have the absolute right to identify the person. They always have that right. They have the right to frisk the person for weapons and for evidence at the time that they're arresting them. This is once they've obtained probable cause for an arrest, whether a misdemeanor or a felony, they're going to be allowed to take all reasonable steps to identify someone. That can include photographs, etc. We've worked with jails and other places to prevent the removal of photograph without religious clothing on the part, because it's humiliating, and the treatment should not be humiliating or degrading. However, when the law enforcement arrests someone, here is the part: whatever they're doing at that moment in time, they're right, even if they're wrong. And what I mean by that is physically resisting law enforcement is a crime in and of itself. The way to take it on is to take on civil suits afterwards for what happened, rather than physical or saying, wait a second, you can't do that or I won't remove it. So yes, unfortunately, law enforcement has the ability to, if there's an arrest, require someone to remove head carving, other parts, to be able to identify them as part of the arrest process.
Thank you. The second question that we have are, especially for our students that are on campus, what are some possible traps that students may fall into in respects to material support?
All right, Charlie, try to take this one?
Sure.
All right, so, this is just hypotheticals, right? But thinking about what we've seen in speech, especially young people's speech online, right? Charlie had mentioned in some of these entrapment type cases, baiting, right? So this is private groups where, it's just their close friends that they trust, and that these encrypted type platforms, but some people that they've invited in themselves are the FBI. And so creating this false sense of privacy in these private groups, and then saying things that, they wouldn't say publicly, or can be misinterpreted, or that's an area for potential concern. Another is the baiting that I was mentioning, right? Young people, if they're pushed, especially very differently from ISIS or Al Qaeda, where people had a very clear understanding, that yes, these are bad guys, these are terrorists, and nobody supports them. There's a lot of mixed political speech happening around the resistance and Gaza and Palestine. And so the mixing of that speech and the potential for, the entrapment looking like pushing somebody, asking, well, how can we support them? Shouldn't we support them more? Do you condemn them? Do you think this was a good idea or that was a good idea? So, seeing how the speech is playing out in a lot of these groups, even in public, right? I see Instagram posts like this that are just right on the line of maybe if they were clear in what they meant or knew how it would be viewed, that they may be a little bit more careful.
I'll add to that. There's two parts that I've seen them that fall into where you're vulnerable. The first part is people become students and online activists or all these becoming angry. It's very easy to be angry. There's an awful looking out there. It's very easy to see discriminate treatment, to see protests and being broken up in manners that don't make sense and are not proportional. And that anger then leads to angry statements. And people will then echo those statements, and then there's a call to action. And suddenly, what you started out as a nonviolent, principled movement, all of this sort of thing, finds its way into something that you didn't intend to do. You didn't have any idea to do and didn't have any capability to do, but suddenly there's a new leader who's helping you get there. And I say in this part is you've lost sight of your principles and it's time to immediately reassess. The other thing that we've seen in our cases, particularly in that GM Petro case, is there's this fear of saying, well, no, don't do that. That's illegal, for being called out for not being in the peer pressure, not being with the cause. This is, well, you've got to support the cause. No, you by lawful protest and lawful speech, you're supporting it. You don't have to do more. And yet people feel the peer pressure in this circle that they need to do more. And the FBI's undercover informants are very good at creating that pressure to do more and challenging people to do more. And those are the traps. When people start challenging you and saying, you need to do more, that's a pretty good part to go on part.
That's very insightful, and that's really good advice. The last question here, I'd like to address it to the both of you again, is what are some things that protesters, especially those that have been arrested, what should they be aware of, and how can they tell if they may be under federal investigation or if the charges might escalate?
Okay, those are great questions. Boy, that's a great question. Couple of things. And we saw that. I'm going to use a different example. I'm going to use January 6th because Sufia and I have watched January 6th very closely because while we may not agree with the cause, we're interested in the prosecution tactics. When mass protesters are arrested, the first thing that you should be aware of, other than if there's a part that says we're escalating the charges. Now, the charges often begin as tickets or misdemeanor trespassing, but suddenly there's, well, we're looking at escalating charges. That's an immediate time to call us, okay? Because the escalation is atypical. The next part comes in is immediately after arrest, new friends approach you. New friends. Suddenly you have new friends. I saw how you were treated. Come with us. What we'd seen in this, where we'd seen that particularly, was when Twitter and Facebook banned people. That was the FBI's absolute ticket in. Come join our group. It's all composed of undercover informants, but come join our group in this process because people were angry. They're upset and they've lost their ability to think for a little while carefully on that. So what are the things that, hey, look, I'm being targeted. The last one becomes, I'm being approached by people who are suggesting, regardless, more radical approaches. And they want to talk to me in private. It makes so much sense. I want to talk to you about really radical stuff. And of course, the idea is to get you away from the group and then try and talk you into doing this. This is what we have seen in every case that we have represented in these types of areas, is the pulling people out of the group that you were in and trying to put you in a new group. Because the group you were in might have been arrested for place manner, but the speech was constitutional. They want to move you someplace else. Okay? And those are parts on it. The last one is somewhere in there, the FBI agents show up at the part and say, I want to talk to you. It can be that blatant. And hey, you're in a lot of trouble here, and we can help you with the university, but you need to talk to us. And there are a lot of people who are like, oh man, I need to get my degree. I need to get back on this. And maybe if I just talk to these FBI agents and explain that I was engaged in First Amendment conduct, it'll all be okay. They want to talk their way out. Won't work. They're here, anyone who comes at your darkest moments or when you're and offers to help, and they're not lawyers and they're not part of a legal foundation, aren't here to help. Sufia, you got some stuff to add?
Yeah, so what I'll just add to that is just sort of maybe giving some examples of what Charlie's talking about, right? So we've had cases, for example, where a fake religious leader, in the Jim Petro case he was talking about, they approached her with a Saudi sheikh, and that he was a religious leader. He was an FBI agent online. She, wasn't interacting with him in person. And he's sending her, these totally misinterpreted Quran verses, hadith, essentially trying to convince her that she should travel abroad to join a terrorist organization. She combated all of that because she had some Islamic knowledge, but she was a recent revert. And so we've seen this in a lot of those cases where they approach them with this radical religious talk. And if that doesn't work, it didn't, for example, on Georgiana, it didn't work. And so they surprised her one day where her best friend of 2 years, who was also an FBI agent, told her, announced suddenly out of the blue that she was going to go and travel and join an organization. And Georgiana's efforts to stop her actually were ended up being charged as material support. Other things, right? Jason Fong, we have these private groups like what I was talking about, where several of the people he invited to his private group were FBI, and they're the ones pushing, sometimes in other private chats with group members, pushing, these radical ideas, bringing up specific terrorist organizations by names, creating that link, that direction and control, right? So if an easy way to think is if you are somebody who really is in this for the cause, you're advocating, you never talked about specific terrorist organizations or specific individuals or organizations, and all of a sudden you have people approaching you, pushing you to talk about specific terrorist organizations, or they mention that they have a tie to a terrorist organization. I saw a report of that recently, somebody in New York that was embedded with all the protesters, and he had been boasting to them that he had ties to one of the designated organizations in Gaza. That should set off all the alarm bells for you. You should be thinking direction, coordination. No one was here talking about Hamas, and all this guy is doing is trying to tie everybody to them in some way. So it's these kinds of things where it's pushing you over a line that you never have intended to cross. It will probably be things that are making you uncomfortable. You have questions, reach out and get advice at that time, especially for the protester. That's what I love about the question. The ones who have been arrested, because, that quote that I had at the beginning, the FBI is looking for the needle in a stack of needles. The needles are looking for those people, right? They have that demonstrated support. They've crossed the legal line in this very small misdemeanor way, but these are the kinds of places where they start their focus and they feel it may be easier to push people over the line, or they know that they're very passionate and they may be able to say things.
Thank you, Sufia, and thank you, Charlie. This has been very, very insightful and excellent tips. And to be able to trust your gut and to be able to assess the situation and know When something doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. And that's a good time to reach out and have professional guidance and support. And so I want to thank the two of you for joining us today and sharing this wealth of information. And I also want to, on behalf of the Muslim Legal Fund of America, I would like to thank all of our guests that have attended today's Town Hall Live. This is being recorded and will be shared online as well. And the Muslim Legal Fund of America is fighting for national security reform, upholding and establishing justice in our courtrooms and communities for Muslims in America. So thank you so much for everybody. Can we pull up the slide with the upcoming town halls? So this is a series of town halls that is taking place. Our next one is tomorrow, and it will be focused on social media impact in civil laws. What you can post, can it hurt you? So for those of us that are here today, please spread the word. Please come back and join tomorrow. And as you can see on the screen, there are upcoming topics that we'll be addressing as well. And as always, your support, your prayers, and your donations are what fuel the work that we do. So we want to thank you. And please grab a picture of that QR code and please continue to donate so we can continue to stand up for justice in the courtrooms and in our communities. Thank you so much for attending. We will see you tomorrow.